Hey everybody. It is what is it? Wednesday morning. Yeah. Um anyways, sort of sitting around waiting to do a few things and decided to jump on because I was thinking about something that I thought was interesting. It's interesting to me, and all this stuff is. And that is maybe, maybe for those of you who are sort of new to this and trying to get a gist of how to think about the different functions, or for those of you who've been around forever and know everything there is to know, something interesting to think about. And that's how I was thinking about how different types of humor map on to the different types of functions, right? Like how each function sort of has its own funny bone that different types of humor are going to tickle, right? And it's sort of a good way of thinking about what the different functions are doing, if you think about it this way. So let me just sort of go through it and you'll see what I'm talking about. But a couple of things to sort of preface with. Number one, um, I'm not trying to say that, if you have a lead, that only people with a certain lead function find this stuff funny. I mean, I think everybody can find every type of this humor funny. It just is whatever your attention is drawn to, and then something surprising happens, and that's what makes it funny, right? But it's the different types of attention. So don't think just because you're an INFJ, you're only going to find NI type of humor funny. You might not find it funny at all, but you probably do. Um, and then the other thing is, I'm getting, the examples I talk about, I'm not trying to say that any particular person or comedian who uses this type of humor is necessarily dominant in that function or uses that function, or I'm not trying to type anybody. So this isn't trying to say that Jerry Seinfeld is an ISFJ or something because he uses SI humor. um, so with that out of the way, hopefully we can avoid um, confusion there. Okay, so let's go through. So NI. So I find NI humor to be the funny because it's true type of humor, right? And more specifically, sort of, it's funny because I never really thought about it that way kind of humor. So to me, the best example of this type of humor is Mitch Hedberg, who was comedian back in the 90s, early 2000s, who unfortunately passed away pretty young. But, he's got plenty of stuff out there on YouTube, and it's all just these sort of one-liners. For example, a good example of this would be his bit about how escalators never really break, they just turn into stairs, right? Um, a very NI type of thing. It's kind of a funny little joke, but it's funny because it's true and you never really thought about it that way. Very NI. Other sorts of bits, they're all like this. Like, his bit about, my belt holds up my pants, but the belt loops on my pants hold up my belt. So who's the real hero here? Right. Again, never really thought about it that way. That's kind of fun. That's kind of a funny observation. Um, and then finally, his little bit about, you know, getting a receipt at the donut store, and who, when you buy a donut, who really needs a receipt to prove that you bought a donut? um, just little things like that. Now, I mean, he was very out there and kind of absurd, and so I could see why people would think it's sort of NE type of humor, but to me, it's more NI because it's funny because it's true. Like, it's getting at some sort of funny truth about the world. Um, so I'll contrast it to NE humor. NE humor, I find more, I describe it more as it's funny because it's not true, right? Where somebody will sort of say something outlandish or come up with some sort of outlandish scenario or events that are just funny because they're so absurd that they couldn't be true. And I think Dave Chappelle does a lot of this. Now, he does a lot of different types of humor. But one of the types he does is this any type of humor. When, for example, in one of his stand-up specials, he's got this whole bit about being being in a limo, and the limo driver gets upset and take it's somebody and ends up taking him to the ghetto, and he's sort of locked in this car, and there's like a baby on the corner and all this stuff, all this like really outlandish stuff that just couldn't possibly be true, but it's just so close to the truth, or so close to being possible that you find it funny. um and again, he does different types of humor. He'll sort of switch back and forth between different types of humor, but when he's really on his ball, a lot of times it's this any type of wouldn't it be funny if kind of scenario building. So contrast that to like the censor type of humor. I mean, extroverted sensing is going to be like the slapstick stuff, the Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Three Stooges, poke him in the eyeballs, kick him in the groin, fall off the ladder, kind of SE type of humor. Um, and we find it funny because, you have these sort of bumbling idiots that can't really control their environment. Um, and then the SI humor is sort of like the NI humor in the sense that it's sort of tapping into your knowledge function. But instead of NI, well, compared to NI humor, where NI humor is like, yeah, I never really thought about it that way. That's kind of a funny observation. SI humor is more like the Jerry Seinfeld, what's the deal with airplane food, right? Where the comedian sort of drawing off a common experience, or some experience that like people can relate to. And they find it funny because, yeah, it's funny because it's true, but it's also funny because like they can relate to it, right? And you're making some sort of observation, but it's not in that sort of NI kind of way. It's more of like the shared experience that we all have, like how horrible airplane food is, or you know just or how horrible first dates go, or whatever. um just that, that Jerry Seinfeld 80s comedian, what's the deal with this, am I right kind of stuff. So I find that to be the SI humor. Neil Borgazzi, I never know how to pronounce his last name. He's like the new SI guy. Again, he'll just tell these, sort of funny stories about his past, or, situations with his wife or his family or stuff that people can just kind of relate to and they find it funny. That's very SI type of humor. Um, okay, so that's sort of the knowledge, the humor that's sort of tapping into our knowledge about the world and things like that. Um, but then I also think that there's, thinking humor and feeling humor. So the TE humor is similar to SE humor, but it's more about sort of plans going wrong, right? And I think of sort of, the Wile E. Coyote chasing after the road runner. It is very SE, it is very slapstick, but it's also, he lays out these intricate plans, and then something goes horribly wrong, and and he gets the result that's the opposite of what he intended, right? So he buys a big, you know, missile or something that's supposed to shoot at the roadrunner, and then like a screw pops off, and it flips back and it shoots and it hits him, right? So there's the SE slapstick component of that, but there's also the TE component of things just not going according to plan. And I remember when my son was really little, like 3 4 years old, maybe even younger than that, there was this video going around about this pig trying to get cookies that were on the top of a refrigerator, and he had like all these intricate, like he couldn't reach the top, so he had to like do this Wile E. Coyote kind of thing where he was constantly trying to figure out, new schemes or plans or devices to get the cookies off the refrigerator, and they all backfire, right? And it always ended up with him like, in the refrigerator or something, goofy like that. And my kid just found it so funny. Like he could just not stop laughing. And you just watch it over and over again. And he would laugh just as hard every time. And, and I thought, okay, the first time I saw it, I thought it was kind of funny. It was cute. But, I mean, me being TE polar, I guess I just don't get it. I don't know, but he still finds that kind of stuff just hilarious, So things not going according to plan. And he's probably going to be a little engineer or something. He's a very TE kind of guy. So that's TE humor. Again, I'm not trying to say you have to necessarily be dominant in these functions or have these functions to find this stuff funny, but it just kind of maps on, it's just what, if humor is sort of, raising expectations or creating expectations and then pulling the rug and then, something else happens and that's why we find it funny. Think of the different functions and how they sort of expect the world to behave in a certain way, and then you pull out the rug and it behaves something different and you find it funny. So TI humor is totally Monty Python type of stuff, logical fallacies. So for example, in the Holy Grail, the whole bit about burning the witch, or whether they were trying to determine whether somebody was a witch or not, and they go through this whole logical argument of well, witches burn, and the other thing that burns is wood, so witches must be made of wood, and we know that wood floats, so therefore if you throw the witch into a river and she floats, then we know she's a witch because she's made of wood, and so we'll burn her. But if she sinks to the bottom and drowns, then we know she's not a witch, and then we don't have to burn her, right? Just this very like logical, fallacy. And again, it is sort of like any humor, and Monty Python definitely has a lot of any humor, a lot of NI humor too. But it's funny because it's not true, but it's funny because it's not, it's just logically incoherent, right? Or and so logically dumb that that it's funny, right? And so they're notorious for doing little bits like that. So that's very TI humor. And you kind of have to, and the other thing is you sort of have to be in on the joke to find it funny. Like you have to know like what they're talking about at a TI level to find it funny, I think. So that's probably the one area where you probably do need, to be somewhat strong in that function to sort of get it, but whatever. Okay, and then feeling humor. So FI humor to me is sort of like, it's like the Chris Farley, Adam Sandler kind of, overreacting to something that is relatively mundane. The example I think I could think of is there's this old like fake Saturday Night Live commercial with Chris Farley, and they were doing a parody of these old coffee commercials where in the real commercials they'd go up to somebody at a restaurant or something and say, "Hey, did you notice that we replaced your regular coffee with our decaffeinated coffee?" And the person's like, "Oh, well, it tastes just as good. That's great. I'm going to switch to decaffeinated." And that's sort of the commercial. But then they have Chris Farley doing this parody of it. And they tell him, "Yeah, we switched your coffee with decaffeinated," and he just goes absolutely ape shit. It starts, turning over tables and throwing things around and trying to like beat everybody up. Classic Chris Farley, just overreaction. To me, that's very FI type of humor. Not being able to control your emotions or just sort of reacting in the wrong way. Where FE humor is more about, I think, just sort of social ineptness, or maybe being sort of tone deaf, not being able to read the room. Another Chris Farley bit that's more of an FE kind of humor is his Chris Farley show where he's interviewing these famous people like Paul McCartney. And he's just like, hey, remember when you were in the Beatles? That was cool. And he has no idea how to interact with these people or like, host a talk show. It's just hilarious. Very, to me, very effy because he's just not getting the social situation. And probably the best example I could think of for those of you who watched Arrested Development. Arrested Development had a bunch of FE humor because it's all about, especially Job, the one of the brothers, where he would just do these outlandish, completely socially inappropriate things, or would just say things that are just completely socially inappropriate and outlandish. It just had no clue, right? Like, just could not read other people's reactions. And of course, the straight man, funny man, usually pulls off of this type of humor. I probably shouldn't even say some of the stuff he would say on the show, but go watch any sort of Job highlights from Arrested Development. You'll see exactly what I mean. Completely outlandish and completely inappropriate things he would say. Very just kind of effy, going against your effy expectations. Okay, well, I think that's about it. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, comments, any sort of examples you might have. I might, I'm not making any promises, but I might go through and try to make a video, like actually showing clips of this to show what I'm getting at. So hopefully it makes sense, and hopefully it sort of provides a little bit more color of what these different functions are doing and what they're focusing on. All right. See you next time. Bye.